Okay. Hey guys, I'm Master John Drake.
And I'm his student, Millicent Rowan.
Okay. Today we're going to do a video where we discuss kind of our stance in general, because we use a more refused, like we refuse our sword back, kind of close to our hip, as you can see on screen right now, and we have more dagger forward. This is specifically our sword and dagger stance. But we get a lot of questions and sometimes even some kind of criticisms of this. So we're going to kind of discuss why we fight this way, the benefits of it, and why we think it's the and honestly the superior way to fence. And kind of discuss show examples of other high-end fencers using similar techniques as well, and just kind of go over like the benefits of it.
Something to take a look at in this screenshot is John Drake is on the left-hand side, Rowan, myself, is on the right-hand side. Our hips and shoulders have to be really squared up for this to function. Like that's a fundamental part of this style, is that if you try to do our style but try to still profile your hips or profile your shoulders, it'll actually take away from it too much and it'll no longer be effective.
Yeah,
You sort of have to have a you have to do all the things all at the same time.
yeah,
You can't do one piece of it and mix it together.
yeah. So we keep our hips and shoulders square to our opponent. This lets our dagger come really far forward, because you can see like our daggers are up only like a little bit far back from our tips, right?
Mhm.
And this gives us the most amount of time to parry with the dagger as possible, right? Because it's as closest to our opponent's sword as possible. The other thing that's really important is both of our back toe and our front toe are both pointed forward, so we're not doing that teed stance. This allows the hip and the shoulder to be square and more forward, right? If our left toe was pointed more to the left,
Mhm.
then we would not be able to square our hips and shoulders as well, which would make the dagger become less effective.
Yes. I
Um,
actually encourage you while you're watching the video, if you stand up and try holding your feet kind of in a runner stance as if you're about to sprint with your toes forward, and then try it with the back toe teed off and feel how that kind of rotates your hip. In some ways, I feel like it actually disengages your back hip and makes you less able to launch off your back leg.
yeah. Um, part of the reason we do this style is because we don't like it when people touch our sword, right? Like we really don't want our opponent's dagger or their sword to be able to touch our sword. And having our sword back means that someone has to come into range to attack our sword, which puts them in danger and allows us to counterattack them while they're making that tempo. And we have some of the videos we're going to show will show examples of that as well.
Mm.
As well as this also doesn't reveal our range, right? Our hand is farther back, so you can't tell. It's harder to judge off the range because you can't use the sword as well. If our arm was all the way extended out, um, then you could kind of judge off the sword to figure out how close we are to our opponent. Versus this is a little harder to read,
Yeah. So John Drake and I are almost the same height. I think you're 5'7" and I'm 5'5", 5'6". Um,
something like that.
so we're what is that accurate?
That's very close.
Okay, all right, whatever. Anyway, we're similar in height and we're not particularly tall. However, we both have pretty long ranges, and so a comment I get often, comment John often gets is people didn't realize that they were in our range. They didn't realize we could go as far as we can. And part of that is that it's hidden because our hilt is so close to our hip.
Yeah. And I will say, so while we are profiled here, or sorry, square here, when we lunge, we then profile our hips and shoulders out to gain that range. But we're
Mm.
holding it in reserve rather than having it out on the field first, if that makes sense. Like we're keeping it back so then we can then explode out. Um,
It's
and so we'll go ahead and start going to some of the clips to show some of that example. So actually, here's the first clip, and this is actually pretty old. This is from when I was 18, very early on in my fencing, and my hand is still far back and the dagger is still far forward. And one of the things that you can do with this attack, with a refused guard, is that when you start your attack, you don't have to bring your hand forward instantly because my hand is back. He doesn't know where my shot is going until my foot has already landed, and then I bring my sword forward. And you can see
right.
his buckler kind of goes in a weird little circle shape because he's like, I don't know where the sword is coming until I'm way closer, right? And so right here, I start to commit my hand forward. Now that because I've secured his sword with my dagger, right? So I'm very safe in this action. I'm using the dagger to control the line. While some people would do their sword, I used my dagger here. which is part of this way this style works.
Hmm.
And then I'm delaying my hand to kind of like freeze up his defense and then let me go around it.
A really nice thing that you'll feel if you start doing similar style is that using your dagger to parry like that frees up your sword to be able to work. Like when I have to use my sword to do all of my parrying and then also attacking, sometimes I feel like it's slowing my sword down, it's getting it out of play. Whereas if my dagger is able to do all that work for me, then the sword is able to hit. The sword's able to do a stutter, disengage, fake behind the buckler like this.
Yeah,
It feels pretty good.
yeah,
um, Something that I've also had people talk about is that if you're driving your hand forward as a secondary movement and also in a bit of a straight line to their head, especially behind a buckler, they just can't see it. Like if you have something coming straight at you, our brains can't really process that the same way as if it was going to side or up and down.
yeah. And a real good example of that is like brake lights on a car, right? That's why we have brake lights on cars. Otherwise, you would just, if someone braked in front of you, you would just slam right into them because you can't see that your depth is harder to see
Mhm.
versus side to side movement. So keeping your
Yeah.
shot, and this isn't done best. Like I said, this was a long time ago. Um, but you can see the shot is mostly in line with his head, so it's harder to read. And I mostly just go straight forward. But
Mm.
this is early on. This is kind of when we were first sort of playing with some of these concepts here. So it's still early and we hadn't quite figured it all out yet.
But it's a great example of where it comes from.
Yeah, like proto of these techniques. So here's an example, and this here on the right, or sorry, on the left, in the black helm, is Master Toritaka. He is, in my opinion, the best fencer in the world, and he does a refused guard as well, but he is a little different. He has a dropped point here, so his point is low, and he fights a different style. He fights from his own system, which is like the Black Tigers system. It is very good, but it has the same concept, right? The sword is back and down, so it has all the same benefits. You can't really reach it, you can't touch it. His hips and shoulders are square, his toes forward. So there's a lot of similarities in these styles, but it has the same benefits where his hand is back and you can't touch it. And then from here, he does another thing here where because his hand is back, as he's attacking, he can do this disengage where he doesn't have to bring his hand back to avoid the dagger. He just goes forward, and he hasn't even brought his hand really forward much at all yet. Still, right? It's still up by his knee, but he's aimed his point high, which causes his opponent to want to parry high. And then right as the dagger reaches, the sword point reaches above the dagger, he then drops the sword low, or not low, but
Mhm.
like level.
Just below the dagger.
Yeah, just below the dagger and throws straight.
Yeah.
You
It's
can't
very hard to parry that.
Yeah, you could not do this. You could not do this shot with a more extended sword out.
Yes. It
So
would
this
be
is
obvious. It would be very visible if your sword was extended out.
Yeah, and you would probably have to pull your sword back before you threw forward. So the fact that his starts back allows him to have this play with this time and distance here in the middle of his lunge. So
Hmm.
this is another reason we really think that a more refused guard with the sword back like this is just the better way to fence and why it works super well. And then we'll
And
go ahead.
we're going to talk about it in a few different ways, but something to really remember and really look at is as his feet get closer to his opponent, gives the illusion that his hand is going faster. Like a lot of people who fight this style, either Black Tiger style or the John Drake style, um, they get a lot of comments that they seem very fast. But in reality, they've taken up space between their opponent and themselves, and then they're firing their hand at a time when their opponent didn't realize that they were
Yeah,
firing. So it feels much faster, and in a lot of ways it is, because your hand is going a shorter distance.
yeah. And his opponent has less time to know where the shot's going, right? Because he's changed the angle. He hasn't really fully committed till here, and
Mhm.
he's now whatever, like a foot or two, like 3 or 4 feet closer to his opponent than he was when he started.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
very hard to block that.
yeah. So we'll go into the next one, and this is my brother, Master Miguel, and he's actually fighting. He fights the same style that I do, that me and Rowan do, but he's also using a drop point, which is something that we do sometimes as well. And he actually does a very similar technique to what Tora just did here, which is another example of it, where you can see as he starts low, and then as he attacks, he brings the point up just above the dagger, and then drops the point low, and then throws
Hmm.
straight.
He uses his dagger to protect himself from his opponent's blade.
Yeah. And if you remember in the last clip, Tora did the same thing. The dagger is covering the line the whole time. And if you
Hmm.
look, the square hips and shoulders allow for that as well. And he profiles a little bit here to get more range, like we talked about earlier. But his dagger is still forward. Actually, could be a little higher, honestly, but he's still
Hmm.
covering the line, so he's very safe in this. So he performed his offensive action and defensive action at the same time, and he could not have done once again he could not have done this with a more extended guard. So once he's hiding his information, and then he's showing a high line, and then disengaging low, and that
Right.
works so much better. Or it really work. The only reason it works is because he started from a refused stance.
Right.
In that specific variant, he started from a drop point stance as well, but really, just having the sword hand back here by the hip is what really facilitates a lot of these techniques. And then we'll go to the next clip, and this is another example of my brother Miguel. We're going to see him a lot today because he's very good.
He's a
So,
really good example of good fighting.
yeah, and he
It's
moves
very
very
clean.
very clean and smooth, so it's easy to see the actions very well. So here he's fighting against someone who is actually doing something that we don't recommend at all, which is to fight off foot forward. We really
Mhm.
think always your sword foot should lead, because that gives you the range. But we think you should just like so. Some people will do this left foot forward thing because they want to do a lot of things we were just talking about: hide information, keep their sword back,
Mhm.
bring their dagger more forward. The problem is with this, you lose so much range because your
Yeah.
sword foot is back. Um,
And even if they step through, like they do a passing step, a lot of people really like to do that. A passing step is fundamentally slower,
it's so
unfortunately.
slow.
If you guide with your front foot, meaning your sword foot, whether left-handed or right-handed, it is going to be a faster lunge, it's going to be a faster step, and a more effective
Yeah.
fight.
So, in our opinion, you can get all of the benefits with none of the drawbacks of just having your sword refuse, but your sword foot still lead.
Hmm.
And this is an example of another reason this is a good is because this person here in the chainmail tries to reach out and cover Miguel's blade with his dagger, but because he has to get so close to do so, because Miguel is fighting in this refused stance, it's easy for Miguel to just drop his hand a little and his hip a little bit and disengage and just throw straight. And yes, his opponent made a big parry, but if Mike's sword was extended out, like if it was out here, like the point was more forward, his opponent could have picked that blade up and attacked him, and he would have had way less time to disengage.
Yes,
But
the
because
parry probably would have been successful, honestly,
yeah,
if the sword was extended.
so while Miguel is executing very good timing here, it also is it's facilitated by from his stance and his guard, right?
Hmm.
So everything is integrated.
Yep.
Then we'll go to the next clip. So here's actually an example of another fencer. This is Master Donovan from the East, who is fighting the refused guard here in a dagger forward. He's fighting a different style than us, but it's the same. He's using a lot of the same concepts because it tends to be good fencing is good fencing, right? And if you watch here, his opponent here, this is Master Remy. Remy extends his blade out like this, right? And as soon as he
Proper.
does that, Donovan picks it up with the dagger and throws. And as we were talking about the last clip with Miguel, right, where the other person had to reach farther to get the sword, Remy's putting his sword right next to Donovan's dagger like this, right? And so it makes it
Yeah.
really easy from this refused dagger forward stance for Donovan to
To
just
replace.
parry it. And we'll also point out here that Donovan does another thing that's really good is he once again also delays his sword. He actually pulls his sword back a little bit, which I don't think is the best. But the idea here is that he's attacking, but Remy does not know where Donovan's going to attack yet. He could hit him in the foot to the head. Like that's still
Hmm.
up. It's still he could still make that choice to change the targeting. Uh, versus if he brought his hand forward earlier, he would have had to have already committed to a spot, and Remy could have known that and defended it more easily.
Right. You essentially have the luxury of changing your target if you keep your hand
Yeah,
back. You have the luxury of throwing low, you have the luxury of throwing high, you have the luxury of throwing halfway and then changing at the last
yeah.
second.
And and even if Donovan has already made his mind up of where he's going to attack, there's
Hmm.
no way for Remy to know that.
Yes.
Maybe the attack was always going to be to the chest, but Remy doesn't know that because his hand hasn't committed yet. His feet have committed, but his hand hasn't committed. But he's safe because his dagger was protecting him. This is a criticism that people will sometimes have of this style of fighting is they'll say that it's unsafe because the sword hasn't gone to clear the line to continue to control the blade. But that's why you have to use the dagger to do so.
Hmm.
Um,
Dagger and your feet.
Your dagger in your feet, but because like if his dagger wasn't controlling the line, this would be unsafe, right? Neither hand would have controlled the blade. But the thing is, you can use either hand to control your opponent's blade as you're attacking, and using the dagger has a lot of benefit because in the sword, as Rowan was saying earlier, is free to do anything now. Like he could throw a hook shot, he could throw straight, he could throw the knee, the foot, the head. He could do
Mm.
whatever he wants because he's safe and he hasn't committed. And you can see then he then finishes to a straight line shot. And his sword,
This-
his dagger, really good at covering the line the whole time there too.
yeah. We saw the same video from the other side, and the dagger covers it the whole time, and Remy's tip ends up on the outside of the arm.
Yeah, very
So
well
really
done.
good cover.
So go to the next clip here. Here's another example of once again Miguel. Before he was master, this was a very old video, like almost 10 years ago now.
I think Miguel is 18 in this one.
Yes, he
Maybe.
is. He is 18 in this video. So he's fighting here Master Mateo, or now just back then just Don Mateo, but so you see Mateo reached out and tries to gain on the inside line here, but now
Same
his
concept as before.
yeah, but his sword is now very vulnerable to being parried, and Miguel instantly just lunges off of that, uses his dagger to try to cross parry, and Mateo tries to pull his sword back here to keep it clear of the dagger. The problem is when it's being pulled back, it is now not parrying or attacking. So even though Miguel is not physically touching the sword, he's completely safe to throw because Mateo is making a tempo with his sword that is not an attack. So he's completely
Mhm.
safe. And his hand is not committed either, right? Because he's still refused, and he extends out late. And this is actually an example. You can see a little bit of that profiling that we talked about, right? Like his right shoulder comes forward to kind of gain that range.
Right. But that's a finishing movement. We don't start profiled, we finish
Yeah.
profiled. And it's very important. It's a very big difference as far as
Hmm.
you're 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 finishing with the maximum amount of range you have instead of showing them your max range off right off the bat.
Yeah.
Another important thing that comes up often is the as he is parrying Mateo, and you can see that the sword is pulled back. Um, you can't do two things at the same time. So even though we're watching it really slow mo, we're like, well, maybe Mateo could have thrown right behind the dagger. Your brain can only do one thing at a time. Your hand is going to come back, and then it's going to come forward. So if Mateo perhaps had had the sword back, it wouldn't have been possible for it to be cross parried in the same way, and he could have just driven forward behind the dagger if the dagger had missed, for
Yeah.
example. But you just can't do the same thing, or you can't do two things at the same time. If my foot goes forward, I can't also be retreating.
Yes. That's a very good point. And then, okay, we're going to go to our last clip. And this is actually, so this is Master Niccolo from Meridies fighting Rowan here in the green. And Niccolo does not fight with a refused stance most of the time. As you can see here, his sword is forward, even though his dagger is also forward, which I do like. But when he fights against our styles, against Rowan here, you can see that after a few exchanges, he will pull his hand back here in a second and get to almost into our stance right here. Now you can see, now he's come back, his hand is back, his dagger is forward, into this is basically his answer to countering what we're doing is to essentially copy it.
And you can also see like earlier in the fights, he had the profiled hip. His back foot, if you looked at it, it was teed off. His left hip was very far behind. His left shoulder is behind, which is really appropriate for an extended sword. And then later, when he fully commits to the other style, his left hip goes forward, his toes go forward, his shoulder goes forward. It's really important. I can't stress this enough that you must go all the way one direction or all the way the other. Because if you try to have profiled hips but squared shoulders, you're going to be twisting your body in a way that's going to eliminate the benefits of both, unfortunately. So I
Yes.
really like that he fully switches from one to the other.
Yeah.
And I do think this was a good response against me. It was harder to fight against him once he
Yeah.
did this.
So if you go once again, if you go and look at go look at videos of high end fencers, people who are winning tournaments in the SCA, most of them will be doing variants on these refused guards, like we've discussed here in this video. Um, what they were using their offhand forward, usually with a dagger, but it could be with a stick or a buckler. But that will be a big portion of their defense, and their hand will be back. And if they do bring their hand forward, usually it's a bait to try to get someone to
Mm-hmm.
overextend it to them or cover, and then they disengage and hit them. Um, but generally, the more serious of a tournament and the higher end, like the higher, farther in the tournament you go, the farther the hand comes back and the farther the dagger goes forward.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I meant to bring this up earlier. If you if you look at some of the period masters, Fabris would be a great example. He says that if you're facing someone who has a good dagger parry, to bring your sword back and not stick it
Yes.
out forward where they can just parry it. So this is not a historical. This is not a counter historical stance, or it's not a modern stance. This is historical fencers did use this as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you look at the modern recreation that we're doing in the SCA and in HEMA, you'll see very similar. We are bringing the hand back forward, back as well, especially in sword and dagger. I think in single sword it's a little different, but in sword and dagger, the dagger goes forward, the hand goes back, and this is pretty much the best way to fence.
I would also add that even with sword and rigid parry or sword and cloak, we tend to fight the same because the concept is always that your offhand is blocking and your on hand is able to fire. You're bringing
Hmm.
your sword back to get it away from your opponent's defense, so you're less vulnerable.
Yeah, I'll add one more piece here too. We tend to think of the dagger as our primary defense and the sword as a backup,
Mhm.
which is counter to a lot of other ways people fence. Their sword is their primary defense and the dagger is the backup. But one thing that you want to do is, regardless of which is your primary and which is the backup, you really need to fence with both hands. And the best fencers are fencing with both hands, and they have an integrated system where they're using both hands to fence.
Mhm.
And that's the most successful way. It doesn't really matter so much if you pair with your sword or your dagger. It's that you're using both, and you're using good mechanics with both. Because some people will use really good mechanics with their sword, and they'll spend a lot of time practicing that. But then when they go to pair with their sword, or sorry, when they go to pair with
Your
their
dagger.
dagger, they just kind of swat at the sword, and they
Right.
don't have good clean parries.
So it's
Um,
worth it to practice both, drilling both,
yeah,
really focusing on both instead of neglecting one of them because
yeah,
they're both important for keeping you alive in a
and
fight.
I know Rowan has planned to make a video about how to have really good dagger parries. So if you
Hmm.
want, so stay tuned for that. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment or reach out to us on social media. We're happy to answer any questions. We'll probably
Absolutely.
make some follow-ups to this video too. So
Thank you for your time.
thanks for tuning in, guys. We'll see y'all later.
Appreciate you. See you in the next one. Bye.